Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
She called while I was sitting on a cracked cafe chair in a city where I barely knew the street names. Said it the way people announce a weather change, calm and practical and already moving on, that my trust fund was now my stepsister's because she had earned it. And I remember looking at the shadow of my phone on the table and thinking that if I blinked slowly enough I could force my body to treat this as a glitch, not a hit, so I took a breath that tasted like burnt coffee, said thanks for. Sharing in the same tone I used to confirm a dentist appointment, and let her fill the silence with a tidy story about responsibility. About how Emily needed the support more than I did because I was independent and resilient and good at landing on my feet, which, if we are honest, has always been the polite version of you can handle being overlooked because you have practice. She kept talking about fairness while never once using the word, telling me that this was not personal and that I would understand once I was back. As if extra mileage and a different time zone made me less of a person and more of a problem that could be handled after brunch, and I let her talk because interruptions only feed people who believe they are right. So I gave her nothing but air and the occasional and when she paused to ask if I was angry I told her I was fine, that I heard her. That I hoped Emily used the money responsibly, and I swear I could hear the relief click into place in her voice, that tiny exhale of oh good. She'll swallow this the way she swallows everything, and that was the moment I felt my spine settle. Because if you want to see you're to a person, take something they never expected you to contest and watch how fast they assume you will stay soft. I hung up without a scene, told the barista I needed the Wi-Fi password again, opened my laptop, and sat there for a long minute staring at the folder that I had not opened since my father's memorial. The one that held copies of the trust documents and a few emails from the old attorney who never used emojis and who wrote in those patient paragraphs that made you feel 12 and safe. And I remembered how he had told me that confidence is not noise. It is a record, and if you want your future to be boring in a good way, you put the boring work on paper. So I started reading not like a her daughter, but like a person who understands that silence and leverage are cousins. I scrolled past the boilerplate, the polite Latin, the paragraphs that exist to make regular people tired, and I found the parts we had tucked in when I turned 18. The ones that said no change in beneficial interest could occur without a very specific set of signatures and a very specific notice period. And there it was in black and white, the little gate that everyone forgets until they hit it. A clause that allowed a beneficiary who had reason to believe the fund was being diverted, contrary to original intent, to file a protective notice that would force a temporary freeze until an independent review, which sounds technical and dull until you realize that dull is how you stop a moving train without stepping in front of it. I wrote to the trustee using the kind of voice that never wobbles because it never apologizes, attached the documents that mattered and none of the feelings that did not, referenced the clause by name the way a person says a friend's nickname at the right party, and asked for the protective hold pending review due to attempted reassignment without required consents, and then I forwarded that email to the attorney on file with a note that said I believe we may be in the territory we anticipated. Please proceed as appropriate, which is a polite way of saying do the thing we built this for. I am done being polite about being erased. While I waited, my phone buzzed with a picture of Emily holding a fluted glass and flashing that practice smile that always says I deserve this, because I have had a hard year, a caption from my mother about new beginnings and family stepping up. And I stared at it long enough to feel the familiar heat crawl up my throat before I set the phone face down and counted slowly to 10 like a child trying not to cry in a school bathroom, except the tears did not come because anger, when you are old enough to recognize it, sharpens into decisions, and mine was as clear as water. The trustee replied faster than I expected, formal and efficient, confirming receipt, acknowledging the clause, and outlining the steps that would roll forward once the protective notice was filed. And reading that email felt like hearing a safe click open in a quiet room, not because money fixes betrayal, but because boundaries confirm reality. And I realized in that second that my mother's voice on the phone had not been casual so much as certain. Which is worse, and I decided that the best apology I was ever going to get would be the sound of a transfer failing. I signed the documents with the secure key I keep for things that must not fail. uploaded them to the portal that looks like every other portal until it changes your life, and I sat there until the confirmation number written out for the note I keep for myself. Because I refused to let my own memory become a weapon against me landed in my inbox, and when it did I closed the laptop, finished the cold coffee, and let the room return to being just a room, because the move had been made and the rest, whatever noise it planned to make, would have to make it without my help. If you want to know whether I called her back, I did not, because some conversations are traps dressed as reconciliation, and I have learned that the calmest thing you can do with a person who mistakes your quiet for consent is let the paperwork speak first. Which is why, by the time they tried to touch anything, a hand they could not see had already placed it out of reach, and the best part was that no one had to raise their voice. If you want the polite version, I grew up in a house where applause was rationed by need rather than merit, which means the person who fell most often got carried and the person who learned to walk on bruises was told she was resilient. But the impolite version is that my mother got addicted to saving my stepsister and then built a story where I did not need saving, and once you star in a script like that long enough your quiet becomes the soundtrack people use to justify whatever feels convenient. So when she said Emily had earned my future, I heard the echo of every holiday where my wins were framed as evidence I could go without, while Emily's stumbles were paraded as proof she should be upgraded. There are a few greatest hits one carry in the Notes app, like a petty little museum that I used to hate myself for curating and now thank myself for keeping. The afternoon when Emily lost a scholarship because she skipped classes and my mother called the dean to argue that anxiety makes deadlines flexible. The night when my internship offer arrived and my mother smiled the way people smile when they taste something too sweet and said, "Do not make a big deal, your sister had a rough week." The weekend when Emily wrecked a borrowed car and the story became that I should not bring it up because she was fragile, and meanwhile I learned to turn praise into something I folded up and put away in a drawer like a sweater you do not wear because someone else might be cold. None of this is new, and I know some people will say let it go because dwelling is unattractive and grievances do not photograph well, but sometimes the past is not a scrapbook, it is a blueprint. And on the night of that call I looked at my old messages with my father's attorney and found the one where he explained the side letter my father insisted on. The one that did not live in the primary trust document, but sat beside it like a lamp that clarifies a room, stating in plain language that the trust was created to reflect his intent to give me independence without forcing me to ask my mother for permission, and that any attempt to reframe the gift as family equalization would contradict his wishes and should trigger a pause and review. And I could feel my jaw unclench because I am not dramatic by nature, but I do understand a bright line when I see one. So I did what people like my mother never expect because they prefer tears to strategy. I pulled a clean document, drafted a straight line of sentences that did not apologize for existing, and attached copies of everything that mattered, including the email where my mother once wrote that she knew the trust was for me alone and that she would never touch it because it was my father's last promise, a message she probably sent to soothe me after some smaller slight years ago and forgot, but I did not forget since forgetting is a luxury for people who are protected by other people's memories, and I asked the trustee to log a protective hold, to issue a notice of potential breach, and to open a formal accounting that would require every person who had tried to move a single piece of this puzzle to produce receipts, messages, and explanations. Which sounds clinical until you realize that the thing my mother hates more than being told no is being asked to prove she was right. While that machine began to hum in the background, I let myself think about the version of me that would have called back and begged for understanding. The girl who believed that if she just explained her feelings clearly enough, a parent would become a different person. And I felt a pang for her because she tried so hard to be reasonable in rooms where reason was a prop, and I know some of you will disagree with what I did next because it was not gentle and it was not aimed at harmony, but harmony is a song you cannot sing alone, and I had already spent years doing a solo in a duet my mother kept rewriting. I reached out to the old attorney, the one who had spoken at my father's service, with a voice that did not shake. And I asked him to send a preservation notice to my mother and to Emily and to my stepfather, because he has a habit of chiming in when the conversation turns to money. A notice that says do not delete a thing, not a text, not a draft. Not a note scribbled on a grocery list, because every communication related to this trust is now part of a review, and then, because I am done letting narratives grow in private, I authorize the trustee to copy the family accountant who has prepared returns for years, and who knows, down to the last penny, which rescues have been dressed up as necessities. And I told her to schedule an initial call without me so they could explain themselves to someone who bills by the hour and does not do sentimental discounts. If you think that was the move, it was not, it was the warm-up, because the part that made me sit back and breathe in a slow, steady way was the letter I sent to the trustee. Exercising the beneficiary right my father insisted on that allows me to appoint an independent examiner when I believe the spirit of the trust has been compromised. A person whose job is to map intent against action and to recommend remedies including clawbacks, freezes, and, if necessary, referrals to court, and I chose a woman who does not take nonsense from entitled families and who once told a room full of men that tradition is not a defense, it is a habit. And as I hit send, I pictured my mother raising a glass to celebrate Emily's new start, and then pausing when her phone lit up with a subject line she could not spin into a toast, because the audit clock had started, the hold was in place. And every story she told about fairness now had to survive daylight and paper, which is why when I finally did speak that night it was only to my own reflection in the dark laptop screen, saying softly that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people who rewrite you is make them read what they wrote. And by morning the first request for records would be sitting in their inboxes with a deadline that could not be charmed away. The part that still surprises people, especially the ones who think distance equals weakness, is how quickly a plan can solidify when you stop arguing with the story other people wrote for you and start reading the documents you wrote for yourself. Because after the preservation notices went out and the audit request was logged, I sat in that small room abroad with my laptop humming like a tired animal and went back to the clauses most beneficiaries never read past, the paragraphs about successor trustees and advisory roles, and, tucked there like a plain key on a crowded ring, the line my father had pressed for that named a trust protector with authority to replace any trustee who failed to enforce original intent without fear or favor. A role that had been assigned to the old attorney for the first stretch after my father died and then, per a simple schedule almost nobody remembered, had rolled to me on my 25th birthday with a single notarized acknowledgement that I signed and filed and never thought I would need, and feeling that quiet click of memory line up with power did not make me giddy so much as steady, which is far more useful when you are about to pull a lever other people forgot you could touch. I drafted the notice to the current trustee with the same careful bluntness I had used the night before, explaining that given the attempted reassignment and the predictable family pressure that would follow, I no longer believed a small boutique office with holiday cards from my mother on its front desk could provide the neutral enforcement my father intended, and that in accordance with the protector authority, I was appointing a national fiduciary firm that specializes in contested family instruments and has a reputation for being allergic to drama and immune to guilt, and, because I did not want to gift anyone a delay tactic, I had already secured their acceptance and had the countersigned appointment letter ready to attach, which meant that by the time the email reached the old trustee's inbox the transition was not a threat, it was a fact with letterhead. Replacing a trustee sounds like a technicality until you understand that it changes the weather in every room your mother thinks she controls, because the new firm's first move, executed with the crisp politeness of people who do this every week, was to circulate a formal hold notice to every bank, broker, and custodian involved, placing a temporary block on disbursements and initiating account reviews to flag any transfers that smelled like last-minute generosity, and within a short hour of their emails going out the promised wire for my stepsister's apartment deposit bounced back to the realtor with a note that said funds subject to trust freeze pending review, which I did not see until later because I was on a call with the examiner confirming her scope and priorities. But I can tell you that reading it after the fact still felt like watching a door swing shut in a hallway where I have always been told to lower my voice. There was noise, of course there was noise. My mother called from her cell, and then from the house line, and then from a number I did not recognize that I imagine belonged to my stepfather who loves to play helpful husband when the topic is money. And when I did not pick up, she sent a long text about humiliation and betrayal and how I was making family matters public, which is a strange accusation to lob at a person only after you tried to reassign their future over the phone like a reservation. And I let the message sit there without response because I had already given the only reply that mattered, a reply written in language that has dates and signatures and can be read aloud in a room where feelings are not evidence. Because I understand that money is rarely the only lever, but it is often the loudest one, I took a deeper breath and used the protector authority again, this time to revoke my mother's designation as informal investment advisor. A role she wore like a perfume at holiday dinners when she wanted to remind everyone that she was the adult in charge, and I replaced her with the independent firm's committee so that every allocation, every sale, every so-called temporary loan would now require a documented rationale and a cosign. Which sounds small until you picture Emily standing in a leasing office with a pen and then watching a manager get an email that says the funds you were expecting are not available because the adult who thought she could move them without consequence no longer has a pen. That works. The examiner, who does not waste syllables, asked me to forward any message that hinted at intent, so I sent the screenshot of my mother's new text where she framed the trust as family equalization, the exact phrasing my father forbade. And I attached the old email where she acknowledged that the fund was my father's last promise to me, and the examiner replied with a simple received and a list of document requests that would land in their inboxes before dinner, including credit card statements for every card historically paid by the trust, and any notes about reimbursements for what my mother liked to call emergencies, which we both know often meant cover the bill now, and I will make it neat later. If you are wondering whether I felt cruel, I did not, because cruelty is secret, and this was the opposite. This was a clean line drawn in permanent ink after years of erasable pencil, and if you are wondering whether I felt satisfied, I did. But not in the way that makes you smug, more in the way that lets your shoulders drop, because finally the math matches the story, and because I am not pretending to be noble, I will also admit that I gave the new trustee permission to initiate clawback letters for any distribution made in the recent window that could not be justified under the original terms, which meant not only would Emily not receive a windfall, she might have to return the small rescues that had been quietly routed her way. And if that sounds vindictive, then maybe you have never had to prove you exist to people who prefer you grateful. When the sun finally pushed a new day into the room, I closed the computer and tried to let my brain idle, but it did not idle for long because an email from the realtor popped into my inbox. A forwarded message asking my mother whether she wanted to hold the unit without funds for a few days or release it to the next applicant, and the silence that followed that message felt like a door closing on a whole era. Which may be why my mother finally sent one last text that said call me now in a tone I recognized from childhood, the one that means consequences only count when they apply to me, and I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a single sentence that was not short so much as final. That the examiner would prefer all future communication in writing, and that any personal conversation would happen only after the review concluded. And as my finger hovered over send, the hotel lobby printer began to spit out the first batch of notices the trustee had couriered for my signature, which is how I knew the next move would not be an argument. It would be a sealed envelope arriving at their door before lunch. By the time the courier slid the envelopes under their door and the new firm's letterhead began to appear in subject lines with phrases my family does not recognize as real until a stranger reads them aloud, I had already accepted that this was not going to be a negotiation but a sorting, where every claim would be matched to paper and every habit would be asked to justify its existence. So when my mother finally reached me through an email that dressed panic as dignity and asked whether I truly meant to embarrass the family, I answered in the only language that stops circular conversations, attaching the acceptance of the independent examiner, the notice of trustee replacement, and the formal hold confirmation. And I told her that any discussion about embarrassment belonged in the private section of her conscience, because what is happening here is not theater, it is administration, which is only dramatic to people who mistake access for entitlement. The new trustee, who treats urgency like a checklist rather than a mood, set a call with me that morning and walked through what they had already done, explained that the freeze was in place across all custodians and that the custodians had acknowledged receipt, noted that they had pulled the last few years of disbursement data and had flagged a repeating category labeled temporary family assistance that lacked the contemporaneous notes required by the instrument, and then they asked me a question nobody in my family has ever asked without an agenda, which was what outcome I wanted beyond stopping the immediate transfer, and I surprised myself with how simple the answer sounded when I said I wanted the document to mean what it says. I wanted the noise to stop, and I wanted a structure that would prevent anyone from trying this again the next time someone decides that my quiet can be taxed. We discussed options in words that are boring on purpose because boring is how permanence is built, and the firm proposed a route that had been buried in the statutes all along, that the trustee, acting within authority and in the best interest of the beneficiary, could pour the assets into a fresh vessel with tighter walls and clearer locks, a move that does not change the beneficiary, but does change the mechanics by which anyone can pretend to tug the handles, and I said yes without throat clearing or apology because I have learned that the person who hesitates to protect herself is often surrounded by people who never hesitate to use her. And within the hour the trustee sent a notice of intended transfer to the examiner and to the interested parties, outlining that the assets would be moved under a jurisdiction whose rules are not swayed by family weather, and that distributions would henceforth require a written statement of purpose tied to the original intent, which means no more vague emergencies and no more sentimental loans to cover lifestyle choices dressed as crises. Predictably, my stepfather tried the tone he reserves for contractors and waiters, wrote that this was heavy-handed and unnecessary, suggested a meeting at the house where we could settle everything like adults, and I asked the trustee to reply on my behalf that a meeting would serve no function since the documents are already clear and the examiner's process does not award points for charm, and then I used the authority my father left me, the one nobody remembers because it was never performed, at a holiday table, to revoke the soft advisory role my mother held and to replace it with the corporate committee at the firm, which sounds like a demotion because it is. And if anyone thinks that is petty, they can bring their feelings to the accounting because feelings do not move funds in this structure anymore. I am not naive about how stories work in families that prefer myth to minutes. So I asked the examiner to go further than a broad review and to issue targeted demands for any reimbursements that had been pulled under the trust umbrella for medical or educational pretenses that did not involve me, and to prepare, if appropriate, a surcharge recommendation, which is a dry phrase that means the person who misused the structure can be made to repay the difference personally, and I will admit that. The thought of my mother signing a check to return money she shifted while calling it fairness made a small, cold part of me feel seen for the first time since I was a teenager who learned to applaud quietly for herself in her own room. When my mother finally broke and called the new trustee, I listened to the recording later, because all calls are recorded now, and I heard her attempt the move that has always worked on people who fear being labeled difficult, saying she was just trying to support both her girls, that I had always been strong and independent, that a mother should be allowed to guide, and the trustee, in a voice that belongs to a professional who does not need anyone's approval to do her job, explained that guidance does not include reallocating beneficial interests without the required consents, that independence is not a legal category, and that the examiner would be in touch to schedule recorded statements. So the best use of her time would be to gather documents rather than narratives, and listening to that call felt like a room being repainted in a color that finally made sense. I closed my laptop and let the quiet stretch until it felt like something I had chosen rather than something imposed, and then I made the move that turned all of this from a defense into a design. I signed the trustee's resolution to complete the transfer into the new structure and to implement a standing rule that any request framed as family equalization would trigger an automatic pause and examiner review before anyone even read the second sentence. And as the e-signature confirmation pinged my inbox, I knew that by the time my mother and Emily dressed themselves in concern and walked into whatever office they had chosen to charm, they would find that the door they counted on had been replaced with a lock that does not respond to warmth. because the assets would be sitting inside a container they cannot touch, and waiting for them there would be a second envelope, this one demanding documentation for every so-called emergency they have billed to my future and giving them a deadline, with a consequence spelled out in the plainest words possible. The examiner scheduled the recorded statements for a late afternoon that landed between their lunch rituals and their evening performance of togetherness. And while I watched the conference window fill with faces I knew too well, I realized that for the first time in years, I did not feel like a child walking into a room where the script had already been handed out. Because the script now was a stack of documents with dates and signatures and clauses my father had insisted on when everyone thought he was being overly careful, and the meeting opened not with a speech from my mother about sacrifice and balance, but with the examiner reading the original intent, the side letter, and the restrictions on any change in beneficial interest. After which she asked my mother to explain, in her own words and without anecdotes, why she had informed me that my trust fund had been reassigned to Emily, and there was a long beat of airless quiet during which I could almost hear the moment she understood that we were not negotiating feelings, we were unpacking facts, and she said what people say when they are used to doors opening just because they knocked, that she was trying to support both her girls, and that I have always been independent. And the examiner nodded the way a surgeon nods before picking up the instrument and asked whether independence appears anywhere in the document as a reason to reallocate my future, which it does not and never did. Emily tried to reroute the conversation into the familiar lane where hardship becomes currency and poor choices become the world's fault. Said she had earned the support because her year had been difficult and because she was finally taking responsibility by signing a lease and, later, possibly going back to school. And the examiner let her finish before asking the kind of question that ends a story without drama, whether any of those plans involved me as a legal obligor under the trust, and when the answer hung there without form, the examiner marked something on her page and moved on to disbursements disguised as emergencies, the spa invoice that had been coded as wellness, the boutique receipt that had been coded as wardrobe replacement after minor damage, the payments labeled temporary that stretched like taffy across seasons, and each time my mother said she would have reimbursed it later. The examiner asked where the reimbursement entries were and whether later had a date. What happened next did not feel like winning a game. It felt like a weight sliding off my lungs, because the trustee joined to confirm that the pour-over into the new structure had completed that morning without incident, that custodians had confirmed receipt and applied the new controls, that my mother's informal advisory status was revoked and replaced by the firm's committee, that an automatic pause now triggered whenever a request contained any version of family equalization language, and that the examiner had recommended a surcharge calculation for amounts characterized as emergency assistance that could not be reconciled with the instrument's purpose, which meant letters would go out by the end of the week proposing repayment schedules unless my mother preferred to challenge the findings in a setting where records are not optional. And as that list landed with the clatter of something unarguable, I watched my mother's eyes move in the small square of her camera, looking for an exit that did not exist. Because I do not enjoy humiliation even when it has been served to me in small daily doses for years, I spoke then in a voice that did not wobble, said that I was willing to authorize the trustee to accept a settlement that would close the surcharge without a courtroom if my mother and my stepfather signed an acknowledgement that the attempted reassignment violated the terms and spirit of the trust, that they repaid the enumerated amounts according to a schedule the trustee would administer, without the possibility of holiday amnesia, and that they agreed to a permanent non-interference provision that barred them from contacting any custodian, advisor, or employee about the structure under any pretense. And when my stepfather started to push for a family meeting, I added that any breach of that provision would trigger a penalty distribution to a charitable fund established in my father's name to provide legal help to daughters who are told that fairness means giving away what was promised to them, a clause that is not about morality so much as it is about incentives, because people who do not believe in boundaries sometimes need to feel them. Emily asked whether there was any path where she still received help, because she was trying and because everything is more expensive now, and I told her, without venom and without apology, That the trust was never a general family purse, and that if she wanted support for school, she could apply to the independent committee the new trustee had added for third-party educational grants, a process that would require a plan, a timeline, and proof of progress, and that I would not be the person she negotiated with ever again, which is not cruel, it is clean, and she looked down in a way that told me she finally understood the difference. The examiner closed the meeting by setting dates that did not bend. The trustee followed with the settlement outline and the repayment options, and my mother tried one last time to turn this into a conversation about love and legacy. Said my father wanted us to be a family, and I said that I believed he wanted clarity and dignity for me because he knew exactly how rooms like this could tilt, and that I was honoring him by making sure his careful work survived the weather of other people's wants. After which I thanked the professionals for their time and clicked leave like a person closing a door that locks automatically. Later that evening, the acknowledgments arrived signed, the first repayment posted to the account like a small, precise apology that does not pretend to be affection. The apartment Emily wanted was listed again with a new photo and a new description that did not include her name. And the last thing I did before I turned off the light was send a quiet letter of wishes to the trustee instructing that when I am gone, anything left will flow to the causes my father actually named, not to anyone who once tried to rename me as the strong one who can go without. And if you are wondering how the conversation with my mother ended, it did not end in a scene or a speech. It ended the night she called me abroad, and I said thanks for sharing, then opened my laptop. Because by the time she saw the papers I filed, it was already over, and what remained after the noise faded was not rage or triumph, but something better, the calm that comes when the future is finally written by the person who has to live it.